So yesterday when Jordan Love was on ESPN on NFL Live, he got asked about adding T. Higgins. And I think with T. Higgins becoming a free agent, unless the Bengals decide to keep him and pay him a lot of money along with Jamar Chase, every team, especially teams that need a receiver, are hoping, or lots of fans at least, are hoping that T. Higgins can be signed to their roster. And so there's been a lot of talk about T. Higgins in Green Bay, not necessarily, legit reports, but there's a lot of noise out there about this potentially happening, as it is with a lot of other teams who want to add a top-tier free agent wide receiver. So Laura Rutledge on NFL Live asked Jordan Love this yesterday. A potential number one wide receiver that could be available in free agency, T. Higgins, what would your thoughts be adding him to your already talented roster? Jordan Love responds, like I said, T is a phenomenal player. I know T pretty well. And, like I said, if you add a really good player to a really good offense, I think the sky is the limit. You can take it some pretty cool places. And so as I touched on in my previous video, where Jordan Love responded to Josh Jacobs' comments, Love said a similar thing there, and that was right after the other question he had answered, that, if you add a good player to a team, obviously it's going to make your team better. And so I think that if you're Jordan Love, he's not out here, being very bold and saying, Brian Gutekunst's better, sign T. Higgins. I just don't think Jordan Love is, at least at that point of his career, he wants to go and try to influence the front office. I don't know if he'll ever get to that point, because as we saw in years past, Aaron Rodgers got frustrated that he wasn't getting input in free agency and those kind of conversations really late in his career. So if Brian Gutekunst isn't wanting to involve Aaron Rodgers, who at the time was already a legend, this was, 2021 is when Rodgers' frustrations came to light publicly in that press conference before either beginning or middle of training camp back in 2021. At that point, even being the great that he already was, Gutekunst was sort of keeping things close in the front office. And so it sounds to me like Brian Gutekunst, for the most part, likes to keep, the players and what they want and what the front office wants to do separate. And I fully understand it, just because the GM and the front offices have to make a lot of business decisions, and it's not always going to be what the players want. But Jordan Love here is playing it pretty cool, not making any kind of bold statements, just saying that basically it sounds like he's open to the Packers adding solid players, which is not surprising to hear a quarterback say, especially about a receiver like a T. Higgins. I still don't think T. Higgins is going to come to Green Bay, even though it would not be a bad thing. I would welcome him coming to Green Bay, even though I don't think it's a necessity to pay a guy $30 million for this Packers team to still be a legit offense. But I do think T. Higgins is going to cost somewhere around that amount of money, just because there's not a lot of free agent receivers out there at T. Higgins' caliber at only 26 years old. And so if you sign T. Higgins, you're getting him at his prime years, signing his first big contract, 26 years old. You can have him in 26, 27, 28. A lot of the other free agents out there are pushing 30, 29 years old, 30 years old, 31 years old. And so he is definitely going to be the guy that is the most sought after. And so because of that, with all these teams who need a receiver, potentially bidding on T. Higgins, offering him whatever they have to offer, it's going to push his price up a big amount. And considering the Packers have never really been a team to use a lot of capital on receivers, they don't like to use first-round picks on receivers. They like to use second-round picks, where they got Devontae Adams, Christian Watson, lots of other guys later in drafts. And also looking at one of Brian Gutekunst's comments at the end of the season, where he made the point that lots of teams that have a top-tier receiver who is getting a lot of the targets don't end up having success. And I think if you look this year, the Eagles, they do have some really solid receivers. A.J. Brown, who I'd say is one of those top-tier type targets. But the Chiefs, on the other hand, don't have that kind of guy. They still have Travis Kelce at tight end, but they don't have a legit, number one type receiver that is getting a bulk of the targets. And we saw with the Chiefs early on with Tyreek Hill, that was a lot different. But when you start to pay a quarterback, $55 million per year, or the Chiefs, whatever it was when they first signed Patrick Mahomes, you can't be spending a ton of money on the offensive side of the ball, or your defense is going to struggle. And it looks like now the Chiefs are a very solid defensive team. Their offense during the year wasn't quite as great as it had been in years past. And I think that you have to start making decisions about your roster and where you want to invest your money. And I think that when you have a top-tier quarterback, the expectation from a lot of the GMs is that they'll raise the level of play at receiver, even if it's a guy who maybe isn't a top-tier guy. If you have a Mahomes, if you have a Joe Burrow, even Jordan Love, that guy should be able to elevate some of these guys who maybe wouldn't be quite as good in different offenses. And we saw that in Green Bay for a long time. There was always talk for a good amount of time that the Packers should add another receiver, or draft a number one receiver, or draft a first-round receiver. When they had Devontae, there was a lot of talk about that they needed someone better than, MVS or Al Lazard, and yet Gutekunst wasn't out there at the trade deadline trading for big-name receivers like Odell a few years ago. I was hoping he would. He didn't. He didn't draft first-round receivers with Rodgers still here. And so I think we've just fully seen what Brian Gutekunst wants to do. He doesn't want to go out there and spend top-tier money on receivers. Now, could that change out of nowhere? It could. I think the Packers are going to make some kind of big move this offseason. I would rather it be at edge rusher. I would rather the Packers, if they had to choose, spend $20+ million on an edge rusher than $20+ million on a receiver, just because I do think that the Packers have enough talent offensively to still be really good. And I think that some of these cheaper veteran options just make more sense for the overall team, for this Packers team. And as I've said, would I be opposed to adding T. Higgins or some of these other top-tier receivers? No, that would make this offense better, but it really comes down to the salary cap. Where do you want to invest all of your money? The Packers' offense is already stacked. I think edge rusher is the number one priority, and if signing T. Higgins meant the Packers couldn't add a top-tier edge rusher, I don't want to sign T. Higgins. And so, obviously, in a vacuum, if you could sign any player you want, T. Higgins would be awesome. But if that means you can't spend money on a guy like Myles Garrett, I am not in on T. Higgins. So it comes down to how the Packers want to, split this money and spend this money. And of course, Jordan Love is going to be very happy, very satisfied if they were to add a guy like a T. Higgins, who is a very reliable receiver. And I think looking at this Packers receiver room, as I've already talked about a lot, there is still a lot of potential. And Josh Jacobs, with his comments, did make the point that there is a lot of potential in these guys. And his point was that the Packers need to add a consistent guy who's already proven. And I understand that viewpoint. At the same time, there is a possibility that if the Packers kept the same group, maybe added a cheap veteran, maybe drafted a guy rounds 2 through 4, they could still be a top-tier offense. They already were this year. I think they struggled in some big-time games. Part of that's on Jordan Love. But when we look at some of the drop issues, looking at a lot of different players' drop percentages, it isn't always something that carries on from year to year. I put out on X earlier today about Dontavian Wicks. Let me pull this up right here. But, Davante Adams struggled in a big way in his second year when it came to drops, and I shared some stats on that. I said here on X at LukeBeller3, I'm not out on Dontavian Wicks becoming a legit receiver if he cleans up the drops. He had a 18% drop percentage in 2024. Davante Adams had a 15.6 drop percentage his second year and has never been over 10% again until this year at 10.5%. And so I'm thankful the Packers did not look at Davante Adams, second season and say, you know what, this guy hasn't been great. We don't want him to take a lot of snaps. We're going to try some other guys. If they had done that, they would have missed out on who Davante Adams became. And so Dontavian Wicks is an insanely gifted athlete, an insanely gifted route runner. And if he cleans up those drops, which I don't think is out of the realm of possibilities, he could be a good enough number 2 outside receiver next to Dobbs with Jaden Reed in the slot. With that, there is the uncertainty. You don't know, and so that's why adding a veteran could give you more certainty entering 2025, or if you stick with the guys here, like Wicks, there is some more uncertainty, but there's no... There's a possibility he could bounce back, because if you look at his first year, Dontavian Wicks, he didn't really have a drop problem. He had a 4.7% drop rate, so it basically tripled a little more in his second year this past season. So I think he could clean that up. And so there's a lot of different ways the Packers could address this receiver room, not address it, but those are basically my thoughts on the whole situation. If you want more Packers content, feel free to subscribe down below, and I'll see you guys next time.